So in the previous video, we talked about the red channel by itself. Like we talked about the red channel. We said, what does it mean to see white and gray in each channel? But we haven't actually started putting the RGB values together, like putting red, green, and blue together and see what would that give us in the final mix. So this is what I'm going to do now in this video. We're going to start discussing that. How do I look at the three channels, and from looking at each of the three, I can start guessing correctly what would the final mix be. So let's go to our Word document. We're going to start with simple values. So if I tell you that we have a pixel, and that pixel in the amount of red is 0, the amount of green is 0, and the amount of blue is 0, can you guess what would that pixel look like? If you have 0 red, 0 green, and 0 blue, that pixel, the end color of that pixel will be black. All right, so if you guess that, that would be correct. Can you guess this one now? What if I told you we're going to put the maximum for the red, the maximum for the green, the maximum for the blue? The answer is that mix will end up giving you something that is white. All right, now, if you ever got confused about why in RGB values, if you put 0, 0, 0, that gives you black, and if you put 255, 255, 255, that gets you white, you can think of the following question. It's a really simple question. The RGB mode is used in all screens, so it's used in your computer screen, iPad screen, tablet, phone screen. Even when you go to a movie theater, if it's a digital projection, it's using that same mode. Any projector, any screen you see in front of you is basically using an RGB color mode. And if I ask you, what does the screen look like if you turn it off, right? If you turn any screen off, what does it look like? The answer, it's black. So that's why if you put 0 red, 0 green, and 0 blue, you get black in the RGB color mode. If you want to see white on the screen, then you have to put a maximum value of red, green, and blue. All right, one other thing I want to clarify also as well is every screen that you are working with is made of pixels, and that these pixels have three components, have a red amount, a green amount, and a blue amount. So that's why we're using RGB values to represent the colors on a screen. All right, now while we're doing this, I'm going to also go to Photoshop, and we're going to start working with something called the color picker. So the color picker is located in your toolbar here, and it's all the way down. You can see the foreground and background colors. And if I double click at any one of the two, like I'm double clicking at the first one, that's the foreground color. If I double click at it, that will open for me the color picker in Photoshop. So again, you go to the toolbar, you go all the way down, you're going to see the color picker. You double click at the color here. That will open the color picker for the foreground color. So we're going to focus on these numbers now. We're going to focus on RGB, all right? So here's the current color. Here's the new color. The current color in my screen is blue, so here's that. And I haven't changed it, so the new color is the same. But if I go to red, put 0, green, put 0, and also blue and put 0, notice that the new color will be what? The new color will be black, all right? Now, if I go to the red and put 255, go to the green and put 255, go to the blue and put 255, the new color will be white. What we are doing today is we are developing your understanding of these numbers so that you are not guessing and these numbers are not something that doesn't make sense to you. We are building an understanding of RGB numbers because so many things in Photoshop falls in place if you understand these numbers, all right? So I wrote a couple questions in my document, which is what does 0 and 0 and 0 will give us? We said black. What does 255, 255, 255 white? Can you guess what would 128, 128, 128 give us? So if you answered the mid-tone gray, like that's the exact gray in the middle between black and white, because we are putting half the value of red, half the value of green, half the value of blue. Can you guess what would this look like? 50, 50, 50. All right, and the answer, this would be dark gray, all right, because we have a low number. 50 is close to 0, so it's not 0. 0 will give you black. It's close to it, but it's not black. What about 200, 200, and 200? 200 would be light or bright gray, all right? So that's what this looks like. Now, let's go to the color picker and confirm these values. So if I go in the amount of red and put 128, go to the amount of green and also put 128, and then go to the amount of blue and put 128, this is the mid-tone gray, all right? That's the mid-tone gray. And if we want to try the last two numbers, I put 50, 50, 50, all right? So that's a dark gray. And if I switch them to 200, 200, 200, that will give us a light gray. Okay, so now we're going to go to an important rule when we understand RGB values, which is the following. If you place the same amount for red and green and blue, your final mix in the RGB result will always be grayscale. All right, your final mix in the RGB result will always be grayscale. And there's something else, which is saturation equals 0%. So when you have grayscale, that means the color strength, the color purity is 0% because you don't actually have a color technically at this point. What you have is a grayscale tone. So technically black and white and grayscales are not defined as colors. They are defined as grayscale. So when we say I have a grayscale mix, that means also the saturation value or the color strength is 0%. So if I go to my images here and I click cancel for a minute and just look at the image, and we can find like this area is almost grayscale, so that's a very weak color here. Anything that is almost white will also be lower saturation. If I go here and look at RGB, the clouds are almost grayscale, so the saturation is 0% for the areas of the clouds. All right, now let's look at the color picker and confirm these values as well. So if I go to the color picker here and I'm going to put the same number for RGB, any random number, let's say I'm going to put 75, 75, 75. So here's the three numbers that I put here. And now I want you to look at this value. This is saturation. What's the saturation that results from that? The saturation is 0%. So anytime you put RGB as the same numbers, the end result is also saturation will be 0%. You're not going to get any color because you're looking at grayscale. All right, now let's do something else. I'm going to use the eyedropper here. And I'm going to use the eyedropper to sample a color. That color will go in the foreground. So when I click here, it will sample that color. That color now is placed in the foreground. So I'm going to try it again. I'm going to sample that color. And then once I sample that color, I can go to the toolbar and double click here to see what are the RGB values for it. So we're going to see that this color is almost white. It's not exactly white, but the red amount is 242. Remember, the maximum is 255, so it's pretty close to the maximum. The green amount is 235, the green amount is slightly lower, and the blue amount is also slightly lower, but all of them are pretty high. All of them are past 200, so it's not exactly white, 255, 255, 255, it's close to it. But because the numbers are very close to each other, notice the saturation is what? The saturation is low. The saturation is only 10%. All right, so I'm going to click cancel, and I'm going to go to this image here. And I'm going to sample this color instead. So that's the red here. I'm going to sample one of those red tones. And then I'm going to go back to double click here to open the color picker. And I want you to notice this. The amount of red is almost 200. But the amount of green and the amount of blue is a lot lower. All right. So the green is only 37 and the blue is only 78. If I round these numbers, we can say, for example, the red is 200 and the green is 40. And the blue is 80. Like if we just round them to make it easier to remember the numbers, 240 and 80. And notice in this case, the numbers are not close to each other. So what happens to saturation? Saturation becomes a lot higher. Saturation becomes 80% in that case. All right. So if I go back to my notes, we can say that if RGB values are the same, the final mix will be grayscale. And that also results in 0% saturation. Okay, what is saturation? The strength of a color. So what is the saturation of black? The answer is 0%. What's the saturation of white? The answer is also 0%. What's the saturation of the mid-tone gray? Also 0%. What's the saturation of any grayscale tone? 0%. Anything that is grayscale will result in the RGB value being the same and result in saturation being 0%. What I highly recommend is that you open the color picker in Photoshop and do values like what I'm doing here. Try these values and see if saturation makes sense, see if the new color you're writing makes sense. Again, we're building our understanding for RGB values. It needs a little bit of practice so that things make sense, but I assure you that once they make sense, you're going to be able to do a lot of things in Photoshop correctly. All right, so it helps a lot in so many ways when we move in Photoshop. Let me give you an example. If I go to layer, new adjustment layer, levels, which is something we're going to cover in details as we move forward in the second level of the course. When I use a layer called levels, it will help if I understand RGB values to understand this diagram. So that will explain to me why I have 0 here, why I have 255 here, why these numbers in particular. It will also help me understand when I change one of those sliders, why it does that to the image. Why does it make parts of the image lighter and darker? That is related to what we are just looking at right now. So what we are learning now is the theory behind how this command works. And if I switch that command to, let's say, the red channel and do this, that will increase the red. And if I do that, that will give me cyan. Why is it doing that? The answer lies on what we are doing today in understanding the color values to be able to do that. So that's something, again, when you have a better understanding of RGB values, a lot of things make sense in Photoshop. So I'm going to go back to my notes here before we go to the next video.